I'm your host, Adrienne Gold Davis, and I want to welcome you once again to the second episode of this vital three-part Momentum Boost series about modern anti-Semitism and its rise on college campuses and indeed across the world. So for those of you who may have missed the first part of this series last week, we were spellbound as we learned about the steady and shocking trajectory of anti-Semitic ideology, rhetoric, and persecution throughout the ages. As well, just so you know, we have an educational resource, which we're going to put in the chat for you that will help supplement last week's, or if you missed it, really add to it, and help supplement the next few weeks of discussions. But tonight, we're looking at that insidious and confounding state of hatred in higher education and the encountering of anti-Semitism on campus. So, it's tough to be a college student. That time of transition from family home towards independence, well, it has its own unique challenges anyway. And it's even tougher when you're constantly on alert for anti-Semitism, both overt and subtle, in your classes, with your friends, and even from your school administration. So we're going to explore ways in which anti-Semitism presents itself in higher education and the complex historical and modern factors that cause hostility towards Jewish identity on campus. So this session it's vital for parents of all Jewish kids who are going to college in the future, who are there now. And I think it's even more important for the young people themselves. You see, forewarned is forearmed. And today, Jewish parents really need to ensure that their kids can do more than just balance a checkbook or look after their budget or do their own laundry when they leave for their college experiences. You want to make sure that if they're not with you this evening, try to forward this to them, the recording of it afterwards when we send it to you, and anyone else you feel will benefit from this. So we're grateful because this three-part series was made possible by the Russell Berrie Foundation. And like last week, I'm certain you're going to have a lot of questions, and we hope that we'll be able to get to them during the latter part of the discussion. So I'm asking you to write them in the chat throughout, and we're going to keep track of them for you. But I do want to apologize in advance if we don't get to all of them. Anyway, our beloved Dr. Rachel Fish is back with us. She's the founding executive director of the Foundation to Combat Antisemitism. Dr. Fish was also the executive director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University, where she helped train the next generation of academics in the field of Israel studies. She's taught at Brandeis University, at Harvard, at UMass Amherst, and in adult education programs. She's also the co-editor with Ilan Tron of the book Essential Israel, Essays for the 21st Century. Join me in welcoming Dr. Rachel Fish.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. Thank you to the Russell Berrie Foundation and to Momentum for having me participate and present as part of this series. I want to also encourage all of you to review the supplemental resource guide that we created, because I think it will help provide more context and greater breadth to the conversation that we are having tonight, next week, and that we had last week. I'm going to share now my screen, so bear with me for 1 second as I make this full size. Hopefully you can see that. Tonight we're talking about Israel and the Academy, and we're talking specifically about the ways in which Israel is presented within the university and the opportunities and challenges that exist for those students, Jewish and non-Jewish, who identify in support of Israel, who care about Zionism and the collective identity for Jews engaged in the project of self-determination. So in order to understand some of the ways in which a hostile environment has emerged on college campuses, we actually have to step back and look at some of the roots of the phenomena of delegitimization of Israel and the way intellectually this has been cultivated over decades. This didn't just happen last night. It didn't just happen because there was a Likud government in Israel in power for a long period of time. It didn't just happen because Israel is building settlements in the West Bank. And it didn't just happen because of the emergence of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. What we are seeing is a process that has really been happening over a period of decades, and really since the 1960s. And over time, these ideas have provided the intellectual underpinning for some of the Jew hatred and the demonization of Israel on college campuses. And I will just tell you, even before we dig into some of this, that I'll say that when I was a student on college campus and there were challenges on campus, a lot of individuals would say to me who were in the Jewish communal leadership, you know, what happens on college campus stays on college campus. And I remember as, you know, a firecracker young student saying, this isn't Vegas. What happens on campus doesn't stay on campus. And it has long-term implications in terms of media, government, policy, and decision-making. And I have seen that bear out over the last 20 years in particular. So let me share some of these ideas with you. The influence of Professor Edward Syed, who is a well-known academic who taught comparative literature at Columbia University and wrote one of the most important books for Middle East studies at the time in a comparative literature framework around Orientalism. And he wrote this book in order to suggest that those who are indigenous or native to the territory of the Middle East, of the region, are the only individuals who are able to criticize, to engage in criticism of that place. Western society and Westerners had no right to impose their ideas and their values on the region. This idea has had enormous implications in terms of the conversation about Israel. It's often why you will find the idea that Israel is seen as, in many cases, a colonialist entity, that therefore colonialism is seen as a negative. And if it's seen as a negative in the context of these intellectual ideas, it is seen that imperialism is a negative, and Israel is an outpost of a colonialist, imperialist, white outpost in the region that's bringing these Western values. So we know that post-colonialism is the name of the game, and that Orientalism is given priority. We also know that in fields like throughout the humanities, in particular literature, postmodernism has become an important part of this discourse. Now, in the context of comparative literature, postmodernism can be a very useful philosophical approach. However, when it's applied to history, what it attempts to do is suggest that there are no such thing as facts, there is no such thing as objective truth, and so everything is subjective and equal, and all narratives are equal, which is highly problematic if you attempt to engage in serious historical scholarship and want to be able to ensure that students are able to read primary sources and understand certain decisions in the region. We also see the influence of Marxism. And Marxism here is not about the economic understanding of Marxism, but rather in terms of power dynamics. And the idea here is that you need to strengthen the weak and you need to weaken the strong. And in that equation, Israel is viewed as the strong and ought to therefore be weakened. The Arabs are viewed as the weak and therefore ought to be strengthened. This then, of course, plays out in terms of the David and Goliath story, where Israel at one point in time was viewed as the David, and now it is viewed as the Goliath. We also know, in terms of the conversations on campus, that there is an understanding that ideas related to the universal get priority over the particular. Now, what's fascinating about this is that we know, and we talked about it last week, that there needs to be a healthy tension between universalism and particularism, Jewish and democratic. But in this conversation, the idea of liberal values often then, which is interesting when we talk about some of the things we had just mentioned, but the idea of liberalism and those values that we know and are universalized and applied writ large to the conversations, and therefore they are seen as being more valuable than actual certain identities of the particular. but it's only certain identities of the particular, because if everything is viewed through the paradigm of race, class, and gender, then it means that certain particular identities are privileged, but Jews don't fit into that categorization of privilege, because Jews, and by extension Israelis, are deemed to be white and thought to be part of the challenge, the problem that exists within the societal configurations. We also know that the ideas of post-nationalism are ideas, again, that spread throughout the university, and the idea that you blame the nation state for all of the world's problems. We've heard before academics who suggest that nation states are anachronistic, they were from a different time. People from the university tend to laud and extol the idea of the European Union, where we know, even in that situation, these European countries are actually trying to return to some sense of their own national identity. Think about Brexit. And very often on campus, we see the celebration of the therapeutic, where feelings are trumped, or feelings trump facts. Facts don't matter nearly as much, and university administrators rely on the discussion around feelings instead of facts. So some of the pieces that propel this phenomena. There is a seduction of multiculturalism. Now, of course, multiculturalism is a wonderful, incredible idea. But what happens is that there becomes this idea that you're supposed to shed some of your own identity, and only certain groups have to shed that identity, whereas other groups are allowed to keep their particularism. And Jews, again, are in a bit of a crosshairs in terms of that conversation. We also know the younger we go within the Jewish community, we do see a detachment from world Jewry and from Zionism. It's not just from the distancing hypothesis that was authored several years ago at this point, but we see from the data, whether it's from the Claims Conference, whether it's from American Jewish Committee, whether it's from research that's being done in the academy, that there is a sense of the younger you go, no longer feeling as if the collective identity of the Jewish people and Israel as an expression of that collective identity is a central pillar in terms of Jewish identity and Jewish expression. And that lends us to feeling a sense of distance as a tribe. Now, tribalism taken to an extreme can be problematic, but reclaiming tribalism so that we see ourselves as a tribe, I would argue, ought to be a priority. Especially in the American context, Jews are often viewed as a confessional identity, as a religious group, in the way in which many Christian denominations experience their identity. But we know that Jews are not just a confessional identity. We are not just a religious group. We are a people, we are a culture, we are ethnicities. We have multiplicities of identities within our community. And we are a much larger family than just individualized. So we need to be able to express that identity more clearly. And then last week, we did talk about the typical classical forms of anti-Semitism and the tropes that surround those forms of anti-Semitism, from Jew hatred to expressions of hating someone because of their religious beliefs of Judaism and their practices, the racialization of Jew hatred as we experienced during the Holocaust, and then, of course, the ways in which Israel is exemplified as part of the classic anti-Semitic tropes. So all of these together influence the way this phenomena is experienced. Now, as I mentioned, the way in which the university cultivates some of this hostility, we see in a few ways. One, there is a sense of anti-Jewish politics and expressions of demonization of the state of Israel on college campuses. What I mean by that is, if you want to get kosher food at a Hillel or on a campus cafeteria, that's usually not going to be a challenge. I'm not saying it can't be, but usually there are ways to do that. If a student needs to miss an exam because they need to be able to attend services on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, usually there's an understanding. Obviously, there are exceptions. But when you talk about Jewish political identity and there is an example here around Israel and around the way in which Jews hold real power in the context of Israeli society, then you can see serious bubblings or emergence of hostility toward those students. And it can take place on the campus quad. It can happen within the university classroom. It can happen with the student government. It can happen in the student press. And it can come from external sources. And we're going to talk about each of those in just a minute. There's an important professor named Jonathan Haidt. He's a social psychologist at New York University. He also created an organization called Heterodox Academy, which is really focused on trying to bring together multiple perspectives and viewpoints within the university because it is supposed to be the marketplace of ideas. And one of the pieces that Jonathan Haidt authored, an essay, was called The Telos of the University, the purpose of the university. And it's a controversial piece, but it's worth reading. You can find it online. I'm happy to send out the link. But what the argument is in this essay is that there are really two ways in which the university can orient itself. It can pursue tikkun olam, social justice, or it can pursue veritas, emet, truth. And it actually matters which of these the university mission, the university motto decides to pursue. Because if you decide to pursue emet, veritas, truth, then all of the actions that are taken in that university are in the pursuit of truth. Whereas if you are pursuing social justice, your pursuit of truth will be sublimated for certain agendas and individual causes. Now, some would say these are not mutually exclusive, and this is part of the controversy. But why I raise this is because we should be asking ourselves, what is the telos? What is the purpose of the university that your student is on, your family member is on, your grandchild is on, and understand what do they pursue and what are the other activities in terms of the orientation and identifying the way in which they actually engage in educating and pursuing that education. And it matters because if you pursue truth, it is going to be a much less hostile environment for Israel and Zionist students on campus. Whereas if you're pursuing social justice, you will find that that campus tends to be extremely hostile to Israel. Now, students experience these different factors in a variety of ways. And I would argue the three ways primarily are with the faculty, with funding sources having influence, and the university administration. So let's walk through a few of these. In terms of the faculty, what we find with those faculty members who are supportive of Israel is that those who are supportive tend to be very quiet. They do not want to engage at all in the discussion in terms of the way in which they utilize their classroom. They stay true, usually, to the pursuit of their discipline and scholarship. They tend to be conflict averse. These are faculty members who, pursue an academic profession because they want to write. They want to be in the archives. Sometimes they love teaching, but they feel they have something to contribute in terms of the larger discourse, the larger scholarship, and that's why they are there. There is a real fear of personal and professional repercussions. For those faculty members who do not have tenure, do not expect them to get involved in the conversation about Israel, because they know that if they do get involved, it is very unlikely that they will receive tenure. For those faculty who do have tenure, they know that there could potentially be consequences as well. Socially, there are pressures in terms of the collegial relationships in the department. They may not be asked to speak at certain academic conferences. Their manuscripts will not get published by certain academic presses, and they will not get printed by certain academic journals. Those are very real realities that faculty who support Israel have to navigate. I can tell you many examples in which I would meet with faculty who I know care deeply about Israel. And when I would meet with those faculty, they would quietly call me into their office, close the door, and then start whispering and want to know what I was willing to do. but tell me very quietly that they couldn't do anything. So this is a real challenge that exists for many academicians. Now, there are some faculty organizations like the Academic Engagement Network, the Scholars for Peace in the Middle East organization, that have been working with faculty for quite a long time to try to support faculty needs in order to help them navigate these challenges. But for the most part, we find that faculty are conflict averse and actually show a lot of moral cowardice. And they don't serve as the role models we need them to be for our students. I have had many students tell me how their faculty members, who they look up to as the quote unquote grown-up support on campus, will tell them, keep your head down, do your work, stop rocking the boat. Now, juxtapose that against the handful of very vocal faculty on many college campuses. It doesn't take many. You don't have to have an entire faculty enclave. You really just need some faculty who are willing to be vocal about their strong opposition to Zionism and Israel. And they do use their classroom as a bully pulpit to promote a very one-sided political agenda. And many of them serve as faculty mentors or faculty support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement on campus. The second issue relates to funding. Now, this is an issue in which the American Jewish community in particular really hasn't been focused. And I will tell you that it's actually to the detriment, not only for the American Jews, not only for certain subject matters that we study in universities, but it's actually a detriment to all students who study in American universities because they are being bought. Now, I am not a conspiracy theorist, but I can tell you, and I can tell you from my own experiences, that Arab leaders, and I mean government leaders, have bought universities by endowing with $20 million and up gifts to universities for Middle East studies programs, Islamic studies programs, and Arab studies programs. Now, these are from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and many other places in the Arab world. They buy chairs, centers. They have public outreach initiatives specifically targeting K through 12 public school educators. So what does that look like? It looks like at Georgetown University at the Foreign Service Program, for example, where many of our State Department officials and ambassadors come from in the United States, we'll have programs in which they bring individuals who not only support BDS, but individuals who promote a very one-sided political agenda against Israel. They create maps that do not include Israel on it. They use examples of teaching in Arabic that are highly polemical and vitriolic, that are inciting hatred towards Jews. And they develop materials that are used then for public school classrooms as well, in order for those teachers who are teaching about the Middle East, particularly high school educators who don't have the content expertise and need the lecture, so to speak, from a university. So a great example of this was Harvard University Center for Middle Eastern Studies, which ultimately got shut down. It got shut down only for the public outreach initiatives with K through 12 educators. Why? Because they kept bringing speakers and creating content and curricular materials that didn't include Israel, that had very problematic positions toward Israel, and kept getting a lot of bad press that drew attention to certain donors. And eventually the university didn't want to deal with the bad press, so they stopped the K through 12 public initiative. But this happens on a regular basis. And there are certain schools that are notorious for it, usually the elite institutions, Columbia, Harvard, Yale, Georgetown, and there are others. And we don't really have a way to ascertain the amount of influence this foreign funding has on multiple lanes within the university. And the Jewish community hasn't been paying close enough attention to this. And I would say something we should pay much closer attention to. The university administrators. So most university administrators are not interested in dealing with this issue. They do not want to engage in the Israeli-Arab, Israeli-Palestinian conflict on their campus. They recognize that there is some problematic sources of funding, but they actually want to take the money because the argument is you can do good things with bad money. But what happens when that donor from that Arab government decides that they ought to have a say on which faculty member will be hired? What does the university administration do? Usually not the right thing. And so therefore, you can have a problematic hire of a faculty member long-term because they didn't want to stand up to the donor. The administration doesn't necessarily understand why Jews are vulnerable on campus. As we said last week, Jews are not often seen as a vulnerable minority, but rather as part of the white majority. In that situation, there is a desire by the university administrators to want to distance themselves from these conversations. They do not have the sensitivity training that is required to understand the ways in which anti-Semitism manifests and the ways in which that conversation presents itself on college campuses. And we have seen that there are some initiatives that are now emerging, like from Hillel International, the Center for Campus Climate, which is trying its best to begin to create some sensitivity training around Judaism, the Jewish people, and Israel, just like their sensitivity training around race, gender, sexual orientation and identity, and other sort of communal identities. And they want to ensure that the department heads, that the dean of student life, that the Title IX officers have this training so that when a student comes to them, they are prepared to understand that what is actually happening on campus does relate to Jew hatred and is not simply about political speech or academic freedom, which tends to be the typical excuse that you hear being put forth. Now, we know some of the propaganda tools that are utilized by those individuals who promote the demonization of the state of Israel. It includes hijacking the terms and the language that we have already seen through the BDS movement and in general since the period of the 1960s and 1970s by the Arab League, which is suggesting that Israel is an apartheid state, that Israelis are the new Nazis, and that Israel is involved in committing genocide against the Palestinians. Now, obviously, this is very loaded language. It is highly problematic language, and it is extremely emotionally laden language. So in order to unpack a lot of that, students will have difficulty doing so because these terms are used in order to stir emotions and in order to motivate, animate certain actions by students who do not recognize the value of the state of Israel. The other piece of this, which is very complicated, and we'll actually talk more about it next week, is the way in which Palestinianism has become the litmus test for how progressive you are on campus. So what do I mean by that? There's really a list of different sort of ideas and identities that one is supposed to check off in order to have sort of their progressive identity be accepted and recognized on the college campus. You have to be anti-racist. You have to be, anti-homophobic, anti-transphobia, anti-Islamophobia. All of these are good things. But part of what happens is what gets snuck in there is that you also have to be anti-Zionist and anti-Israel. And what you will often hear from many students on campus who do support very progressive communities and progressive ideas, many of the ideas that much of us on this call this evening care deeply about, but they'll say, well, are you willing to call out Israel? Do you think Israel is an apartheid state? And if you don't subscribe to that idea, then your progressivism is going to be questioned. It doesn't matter if you care about all those other communities. They want to know that you outwardly reject Zionism in Israel as a collective Jewish state. And our Jewish students don't know what to do in that situation because many of them are there to say, I want to be an ally. I want to be part of a community. I have a multiple identities. I am part of these other communities. And you're telling me that I'm being excluded from those groups because I also care about my own Jewish people and Israel. And so this becomes a very challenging situation for students. The last two things I would say is that there is a hiding behind human rights rhetoric. It is often, again, manipulated. You see this also from international institutions like the United Nations. Of course, Human Rights Watch calls that out. Hillel Noor is incredible. But our students, of course, don't want to be associated with any potential human rights challenge, because we want to be on the right side of history. We want to ensure that we do have equality for all human beings, dignity for all human beings. So what happens if you are now being labeled the aggressor, the oppressor, the colonialist, which are now code names instead of just being called the Rothschild? And our students, once again, need help to navigate that. And it's also for faculty. Now, the way some of this plays out and these tools are utilized, one is through outside agitators. So this is Abdul Malik. This is a imam who has been coming to UC Irvine for many, many years. And he stands outside in the campus quad, saying things about Israel being the Fourth Reich, suggesting that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians and Muslim brothers and sisters. And he uses the rhetoric very strongly. He cites passages from the Quran calling Jews the sons of monkeys and pigs, and he's allowed to do it. Why is he allowed to do it? Because UC Irvine is a public campus. Now, he couldn't necessarily do that on a private university campus, but he gets away with it, and it's very intimidating for students, not just for Jewish students, for all students, when they see these individuals acting as if they're thugs, trying to intimidate and promote a very scary idea. And for most Jewish students who really aren't interested in this conversation, this is a major reason why they see this as a deterrent, because they don't want to be involved in anything like this. This is a picture from CUNY in New York. Now, this was a very bizarre moment, and there's a whole video on YouTube that you could watch. But what happened in this particular moment was this was supposed to be a rally for students to be able to express their concern about the cost of tuition. And when you watch the actual video, you see that it is a rally in which students are saying the cost is too high, we need to have lower costs. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Black Lives Matter moves into the conversation. These individuals start to walk up front, chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine needs to be free. They unfurl Palestinian flags. All the students who were talking about tuition all of a sudden disappear. It's as if they were enveloped completely. And the Israel conversation becomes the primary conversation at a rally that was supposed to do with tuition costs. This is not unique. This happens on campuses all the time on a variety of issues. Sometimes it's about fossil fuels. Sometimes it's about unions. Sometimes it's about cost of school. And almost inevitably, Israel gets snuck into that equation. Now, what has been the Jewish communal response? I can tell you that 20 years ago, there wasn't much of a Jewish communal response. The Jewish communal response was, Rachel, don't worry, what happens on campus stays on campus. But about 20 years ago, a little bit after that, people said, look, we've got to help students. And so a lot of Jewish donors and philanthropic ventures started to support specifically Jewish students to navigate the anti-Israel sentiment that was emerging on college campuses. Now, those organizations have been doing important work for a long time. I would say most of them are Israel advocacy organizations. They also sometimes engage in combating anti-Semitism, particularly the way it manifests on campus. These are organizations like Stand With Us, Eish Hasbara Fellowships. These are organizations that Chabad and Hillel often also are associated with. There's the APAC on Campus organization. There's also, of course, organizations that are trying to do more Israel education and not just advocacy. But the ADL was not focused on college campuses for the last 20 years. And I want to say that very clearly. Not because the ADL doesn't do important work, but because the ADL didn't want to address anti-Semitism coming from the political left. And so they didn't have anyone on campus because it wasn't just about counting swastikas. So now we know that the students have the support they need. Hillel's Center for Campus Climate is also trying to work with the administrators. And there are some organizations, as I mentioned, that are now trying to also focus on the faculty. But the fact that we avoided the faculty for so long has long-term implications, because that means that for that period of time, basically since the 60s, we were concentrating on the population that's on the campus for the least amount of time, the students. And students are obviously very important, but they're only on campus for 4 to 6 years, whereas faculty can be on campus for decades. And they influence not only what they teach in the classroom, they influence the conferences that are held on campus, they influence the courses that are taught in departments, they influence decision-making at the level of policy for the university administration. So this was a challenge that was neglected. I will also add that for many in the Jewish community, they thought, well, as long as we help the students on campus, then we're doing something. And we are, we have to. But it tends to be very reactive and extremely defensive. And you often see you have to reinvent the wheel every single time. Now, there's some organizations like the Israel Coalition on Campus that is trying to minimize that reinvention because they have best practices now after engaging in numerous battles against BDS, but it still is reactive. So if I were to see someone and I say to them, why do you beat your wife? No matter what anyone says at that moment, the assumption is that person beats his wife. So I've already won the debate. That's what's happening on campus. Our students are automatically caught on the defensive. So I would argue we have to engage teaching our young people first before they ever walk on those college campuses much, much earlier, so that they are better equipped, more prepared, understand the complexity of Israeli society, and understand what anti-Semitism looks like on college campus, which is not the same as what it looks like in terms of just a swastika. And we need to have leadership that is willing to have the moral clarity and the courage to speak up. So my example for this is when President Summers of Harvard University first saw what was happening on campus with BDS at Harvard. He was very clear. He didn't hesitate. He said that this movement is anti-Semitic in effect, if not intent. It is very rare to hear university administrators speak like that. Now, more and more are willing to do so. They ought to be applauded when they do, but too often we hear more silence than anything else. So what do we need? Well, I would argue that we actually need serious and nuanced Israel education. And that is not Israel advocacy. Advocacy can come, but if you have students who don't understand the complexities of what happens in terms of the events of 1937, 1947, what happened in the 1920s, not just the wars, but actually understanding the complexity of the society and Israelis and the Mizrahi who are being absorbed. If we don't actually unpack all of that, we're actually doing a long-term disservice in terms of creating literacy about Israel. I would also say that all of those intellectual factors that I outlined in the beginning, Orientalism, Marxism, postmodernism, postcolonialism, postnationalism, all of those ideas have to be deconstructed. And right now, that hasn't happened in any significant way. So those ideas are still being used in order to create the intellectual framework through which all of this rhetoric is then expelled, utilized. Again, I believe in teaching moral courage at a very young age so that young people, when they encounter this, not only feel like they can say something, will say something. And I would argue that the universities ought to be cultivating brave space, not safe space. We hear so often creating safe space. Of course, physical safety matters, but what I'm talking about is creating intellectually brave spaces that encourage young people to actually think for themselves, hone their critical thinking, where we don't actually have students in their sentences with exclamation points, but rather with question marks. And that's something that I believe we should be doing now before they ever get on campus. And there are a variety of ways in which we can do that. And I'm happy to talk about that also at the end. So I am going to stop sharing and I welcome a conversation with with all of you.
That was very grim. Very, very grim. And yet, not unexpected. One of the things you were talking about hinted towards something a word that gets thrown around a lot, and I'm hoping that you can clarify it. Explain to us what intersectionality is.
Yeah, we're going to actually go into some detail about that next week. But I will just briefly say what it is, because next week we're going to unpack it even more and how it's used.
Okay.
The idea, though, is to say that when you have multiple identities, which we all have, that those identities should be able to help create greater empowerment between those communities. So let me give you an example. If you are a white Jewish woman and you are also then working with a Black woman, your female identity is an intersection of your combined identities.
Okay.
And so therefore, you should be able, these two individuals, to have some ability to align themselves around certain issues. That's the idea.
Right. Okay, well, you'll unpack that more for us next week, because I can already see the loaded questions in it. I have a long list of questions. I'm going to try and move through them because, there's just a lot of curiosity. Because the next one is, do you think that the administrations can try recruiting pro-Israel profs who are not favorable?
So that's not the job of the university administration. I can't imagine a university administrator ever doing that. And I know quite a bit of university administrators. First of all, it's not university administrators who often recruit faculty, it's departments, and those departments recruit faculty based upon subject area expertise that they need in their university. So
Right.
what do I mean? If you teach Jewish studies, for example, and they need someone who knows how to teach Yiddish culture, then that's who they're looking for. Now, you can't say to that person, just like you can't ask their age, if they're married, do they have children, are they going to have children? You can't ask them their political inclinations. It wouldn't be possible. Now, of course, you can do your homework, you can figure out what they've written, what they haven't written, what they've said publicly, but it's not nearly so clean cut to say, this is what I'm looking for. So let me give you an example.
Please.
Many, many years ago, there was a donor who gave money to a school in California. That donor was very interested in creating an Israel studies program. The university gladly accepted the money. This is an individual who is well respected in the Jewish community, very supportive of Israel. The university does their search. The donor was not allowed to be on the search committee, which is the right thing to do. The donor shouldn't say who actually sits. That's one of the challenges. If you give to a university, you don't control what happens with your money.
Right.
The university does a search and hired an Israeli. So the donor thinks, fantastic, we've got an Israeli on our campus. That individual is going to teach about Israel for our student body. Well, that Israeli tended to have political positions that identified with the new historians. The new historians tend to have highly critical views of Israel and Zionism. I'm not saying they are self-hating Jews, but I am saying that they have very clear political perspectives that can color their scholarship. So what you wound up having is an Israeli who talks about how terrible Israel is in his classroom and actually advocates a BDS position. The donor had no say.
Well, buyer beware, I suppose. So do you think that donors are the ones who need to be educated, Jewish donors? Is there any way of influencing the financial influencers?
I definitely think Jewish donors need to be very, very sensitized to how it works when you give money to a university. There needs to be much more education, and it should be done by some of the leading individuals who have an understanding of this and who have been in the university. So in my mind, I'm thinking about people like Mark Yudof, who was the chancellor of the University of California system. He's the chair of the Academic Engagement Network. I'm thinking about people like President Reinhardt, who was the president of Brandeis University. I'm thinking about individuals who understand the politics of the university and know what it means to get money from a donor, and then what happens when that donor actually gives the money. And they could help donors understand what kind of guardrails need to be put in place before you actually make a decision around such a large contribution to a university.
Well, this problem is systemic. I mean, obviously, if it's already leaning in one direction, and if the search committee is looking to lean in the direction that the university is already leaning, then we have this self-perpetuating problem. It's not going to get better anytime soon.
That's right. And there are some individuals who say, look, campus is lost.
This is
so then they say, well, why would I even give to a campus? Or why should we care about programs that support students on campus or faculty on campus? Because the space is so challenging. How do you overcome it? But we know, think about foreign affairs. You can't create a vacuum, because if you create a vacuum, something else moves into that space. Right? Think about radical, extremist groups.
Right.
When you actually move away from a territory, something else has to come in.
Right. So you can't fight City Hall unless you're in City Hall.
Exactly. So you need to be there. So the question is, what kind of scaffolding can be put in place?
Yes.
How do you identify faculty who are able to be serious scholars and at the same time are not fearful of the potential repercussions? That's not easy to do because, faculty have a certain DNA, a certain proclivity to wanting to, not engage in these very public debates, public fights. But we also need to have individuals not to create a politicization on the campus, but rather to be able to support serious, objective, serious education. I mean, that's what's at stake here.
Sure.
And it's huge.
It's massive. I mean, it's our futures. One of the things that worries me the most from a psychological viewpoint, and I mentioned this in the introduction, is that when a kid leaves home, they still are looking for some surrogate parent. And often the prof, unless it's a young and good looking prof, but generally speaking, the prof becomes that intermediary. And when a child is accustomed in their teen years to push away the ideologies and opinions and religion and everything that their parents represent, then they're more vulnerable psychologically to be affected by what happens from what they're hearing. So essentially, a parent is saying, here are all of the things that we stand for. Now, I'm going to send you somewhere where they're going to influence you to feel opposite. What is the armor for that? Does it exist at all? Or is it an oxymoron to think you can arm a child against going against its parents?
Look, I think the armor is strong critical thinking skills. I think that's what we're supposed to be producing when we have serious and substantive education. Meaning my job as a teacher in the classroom is not to tell students what to think, but my job is to teach them how to think, right?
Nice.
So there's a difference. And when I'm in the classroom, my job is not, if I'm teaching in the university, which I do all the time still, my job is not to create Zionists. That's not appropriate in any shape or form. That's what I do in my home. That's what I do if I'm in a Jewish educational setting, along with critical thinking. But in the classroom at a university, my job is to present all of the perspectives, give the historical context, help the students become historians. Who's writing this? For whom? When? In what language? What are the ideas that are being put forth? And to teach them to read with a very critical lens. Critical doesn't mean deconstruction, but critical means to think, right, with question marks all the time. But if we don't do that,
I'm fascinated because, the media also, and the journalist, the state of being a journalist is no longer who, what, when, where, why. Obviously, they're all pundits. So what we have is just this whole system that's destroying critical thinking by removing the objectivity of representing different sides of the coin. Wait, I have to this is like blowing up, man. Okay.
Well, I just have to say one thing to this, Adrian, which is really important. I was talking to a group of master level students at a graduate school of education at two different schools. And I said, why do you want to be teachers? Their answer was to make the world a better place. Now, is that nice? Of course it's nice. Do I appreciate it? Of course I appreciate it. But if that goes back to the purpose of the telos, right? The purpose, that's social justice. That's not truth.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying you can't make the world a better place. Of course you can make the world a better place. But it's like if I say to a journalist, why are you a journalist? They say, because I want to tell the stories of the people who are oppressed. Time out.
Exactly.
That's not the purpose of journalism.
Or education. This is an enormous problem. And the siloing based on social media and the algorithms that'll just feed you back what you believe anyway, it's getting worse and worse. It's terrifying. And people seem to be incapable, adults, not just students who are in their very nature and in their youth, not armored enough, but adults can't seem to listen to nuanced, two-sided positions.
Let me give you another example, because I think the concretization of examples helps you understand how challenging this is. And again, it doesn't mean you cede the space.
Okay.
The Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy existed at Yale. It was a very serious academic center run by Professor Charles Small. What happens? Charles Small teaches about anti-Semitism. Totally kosher to talk about classical forms of anti-Semitism. Jew hatred because of Judaism, right? The religion, classical forms of anti-Semitism that existed within the tropes of Christianity, issues of the racialization of Jews, the experience of the Holocaust. But when Charles Small, an academic, starts to teach about radical Islamism's expression of anti-Semitism, he was shut down. The center was closed. The center no longer exists at Yale, because that didn't fit the narrative. Now, he was accused of being an Islamophobe. He is not. He is accused of hating all Arabs. He does not. But when you actually are willing to talk about the uncomfortable subjects for the purpose of education, if it doesn't fit a sort of appropriate, mainstream accepted paradigm, you will incur serious consequences.
Oh, man. All right, I have to get to this question. How can we guide our young people to both actively work toward anti-racism that allows for both support of Israel and Zionism, but also actively allows for anti-racist perspectives?
So I think this is a very important question. I think it's a question we hear a lot today. I want to say and remind all of us, and it's not just lip service, people like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were Zionists.
Yeah, they were.
Right? People who believed in creating a beloved community, as he articulated, really understood that diverse communities ought to be coming together in order to build a better future for our children. Not because of your skin color, not because of some simplistic categorization that your skin color denotes, but because deep inside, our human consciousness and our integrity demand of us to build bridges between communities. We know that the history of the NAACP, the National Advancement for the Association of Colored People, began with Jews. It's Jews who hold those positions as the early foundation stages. Later, it's African Americans and Blacks who hold those positions of leadership. But we know there have always been, not because everyone always got along, but because there was understanding between the Black and Jewish communities of what it means to be a stranger in a strange land, what it means to be the ger, right? We're commanded 36 times in our Torah to remember what it means to be the ger. We just had Pesach a few weeks ago. We recall sitting at the table, every Seder, what it means to be the ger. Now, has the Jewish community always done its best building bridges with the African American and Black community? No. Just like the African American Black community hasn't done their best with the Jews.
Indeed.
Let's not forget, the Nation of Islam, and Farrakhan are still issues that are a challenge to the Jewish community today. So my argument would be, we have to do our best always to be able to influence those decision makers in order to create as much equality for people who do not have the ability to do so. We have to build long-term sustainable relationships, one-on-one, that are meaningful and substantive in order to engage the communities that we think we ought to be a part of. That means Black and African American community, right? It's been a historic week with George Floyd. We know what this means. And at the same time, just because we do not necessarily all share the same skin color, we need to be able to say, that means I still have vulnerabilities. My skin color doesn't mean that I am exempt from being vulnerable. My history tells me how vulnerable I still am. So therefore, there has to be much greater communication between these two, and I don't see them as being mutually exclusive, but you will find some who do.
Oh, yes. I'm going to give you one last question and ask you to give us final words, because we're all already anticipating next week and looking forward to it. How do we prioritize pursuing justice while we are motivated by truth? How do you see social justice and truth intersecting? Can this be like a Venn diagram, or do they have to be separate?
Yeah, I highly recommend reading Professor Haidt's piece, The Telos of the University. As I said, it is a controversial piece, but I think he pushes us intellectually to think about these ideas. I don't think they are completely mutually exclusive. I think there's a natural intersection, but I will say it matters which one you prioritize. So if you prioritize truth, it will lead you in a direction that may be different in terms of the work that you engage in for social justice. And it's the reciprocal. If you pursue social justice, then we have a challenge because it may not actually lead to truth, right? Social justice doesn't always lead to uncovering that truth. So I don't want to say they're mutually exclusive, but I fall on the side of Emmet. I'd like to pursue truth and then figure out, based upon that truth, what my actions need to be in order to reach or aspire to reach that truth through various social justice means.
Wow. You know, we're obviously, no surprise to you, we're in the period of the counting of the Omer, this period of time, the Sfirot. And the dialectic of the first three that we go through are chesed, which is loving kindness. And then on the other side of that is gevura, which is boundaries and strength and discipline. But the middle axis you're supposed to be searching for is called tiferet, and it's often translated as truth. So I would agree with you. Here's to the pursuit of tiferet, of truth. You are a marvel. Any last words before I say goodnight to everybody?
I would just say that I don't want people to leave discouraged, right?
I too late for that.
No, but in all seriousness, for me, this motivates me. It motivates me because there's a real opportunity. Jews don't like to leave things undone, right? We have to stay in the fight. It's not enough just to walk away. We have to continue to find ways to engage in creating the environment we desire to be in and that we desire for our children and our grandchildren. So I would say, rather than walk away and feel as if it's too overwhelming, start small. Where did you go to school? Start to do research on the university you were part of. What do you see happening in that community? What's not happening in that community? Begin to ask questions. Start digging to see who funds what centers. Like, there's real work to be done, but if we all just throw up our hands, nothing's going to be accomplished.
Well, I'm going to end this evening by saying I have a new hashtag. It's like this: Rachel Fish 2024.
Thank you.
I'll vote for you. Thank you so much once again to the Russell Berrie Foundation for sponsoring this incredible series. And to all of you, thanks for joining us. We hope it was as enlightening and educational for you as it was for me. And we're asking you to join us again next week, same time, same day, for the third and final session, which is called From College Campuses to the Real World: How Anti-Semitism Spreads. So to quote Rachel, college definitely isn't like Las Vegas, and what happens on campus will never just stay on campus. And likewise, the rise in anti-Semitism in higher education isn't going to stay just on campus. So we're going to explore the many ways in which anti-Semitism follows college students out into the real world and enters the mainstream of politics and social media, religious institutions, and in fact, your communities. That's from me, Adrienne Gold Davis, and from all of us at Momentum, as we learn, and grow, and fight together. Please try and remember that the highest form of wisdom will always be kindness. Thank you, and good night.